Welcome to the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. The event will begin shortly. Welcome to the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. The event will begin shortly. Welcome to the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. The event will begin shortly. Welcome to the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. The event will begin shortly. Welcome to the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. The event will begin shortly. Welcome to the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. The event will begin shortly.
Started this morning, I'd like to welcome everyone that's on. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So if you're needing CRC CEUs, after you pay the session fee and attend the webinar, you'll be sent a short quiz. Once the entire series is complete, we'll issue your CEU certificate. All of the sessions will be recorded and available for free on our YouTube page, but we will continue to allow people to gain CEU credits by watching the recordings and taking the quiz. So I'd like to start off with an introduction. My name is Alex Heinen. I'm in the Rehabilitation and Addictions program at St. Cloud State. And I'd like to audio describe myself. So I have shoulder length blonde hair, I have glasses, and I have a tan background with a bookshelf. And I'd like to introduce our interpreters that we have on. If you would like to take a moment to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tara. I have shoulder length brown hair and a black shirt with a dark blue background, and I'm a sign language interpreter.
And I'm Adeline Riley. I am a white female with a ponytail and a light colored background and a black shirt. I'm also an interpreter.
And I'd like to introduce my co-host, Nyawuow.
Hello, I'm Nyawuow. I am wearing a dark green shirt and with long black hair, and I'm dark brown.
And then I'd like to introduce our speaker for the day, Andy Imparato. Could you take a moment and introduce yourself and audio describe yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Andy Imparato. I am a middle-aged white man with glasses, and I have on a pink dress shirt and a navy sweater with a zipper at the collar, and I have COVID hair that I put some goop in this morning so it wouldn't look too crazy.
Thank you. So to start off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I think of myself as a second generation disability activist. I graduated law school in 1990, which was the year that the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law. So I'm part of a generation of professionals who inherited civil rights protections from a generation that came before us who worked on getting the Americans with Disabilities Act passed and worked on framing disability as a civil rights issue. During my last semester of law school, I had my first serious episode of depression, ended up getting diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and I've been out and open about my disability throughout my career. I started in Boston, where I worked at the Disability Law Center there doing SSI and Medicaid advocacy. And then I came to Washington, D.C. in '93 to work for Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa, who had been the lead Democrat on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I had a 26-year career in Washington, inside and outside government, and then came back to my home state of California last January to become the executive director at Disability Rights California, which is where I am now. So I'm in Sacramento, and I am doing a lot of work on vaccine prioritization right now with the state. But basically, I'm a policy wonk lawyer with bipolar disorder, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you this morning.
Yeah, we're grateful to have you. Could you talk to us a little bit about your disability?
Yeah, I mean, mine is kind of seasonal, but it's not completely predictable. But if you look at kind of since I started experiencing symptoms, which is now, it's been over 30 years, I tend to kind of lose my energy and lose my self-confidence as the days get shorter, and then my energy tends to go up and my self-confidence tends to go up as the days get longer. There's something called seasonal affective disorder, which generally results in people getting depressed in the wintertime. The reason mine is not just that is that I don't just get depressed in the wintertime, but I also get kind of very high energy, kind of hypomanic in the summertime, and that's not typically what happens to somebody with seasonal affective disorder. I find my highs and my lows are kind of proportional to each other. So if I can manage the highs, then my depression is usually not as bad. And over the years, I've just come up with different strategies to try to manage the symptoms on both ends. When I have my high energy, I tend to be more, I guess, less patient. I'm more able to initiate projects, kind of do big, hard things, uh, generally kind of work longer hours, have trouble sleeping. And then when my energy goes down, it's easier for me to sleep. Um, I've heard people analogize it to hibernation for a bear. I'm just, I'm less active when I'm depressed, but I'm able to get my work done. I've never missed work because of my disability. And I've been blessed to have a lot of success in my career. This is my third CEO job. So I've been a CEO of 3 different organizations for 18 years and been able to do that when I'm depressed and when I have my high energy. And I've come up with techniques over the years to manage the symptoms.
Okay. How has bipolar disorder impacted relationships in your family?
Yeah, I mean, so that's one of the kind of interesting things about bipolar disorder. It tends to run in families. So I have a half brother who's bipolar. I had a sister who died of a drug overdose who got diagnosed with bipolar disorder kind of late in her life. So, I mean, I think it's helpful to be out and open about it, and it's helpful to be able to talk about it. But I think, it definitely creates stress in families, or at least it can. In my immediate family, I'm still married to my college sweetheart. So we actually got married before my diagnosis, and she's been able to navigate the ups and downs with me, and definitely has been one of my most important natural supports. Is what we call it in the disability world. But I just feel very lucky that I married the right person, and she, found a way to continue to love me with all the ups and downs and see, kind of a lot of value in the work that I do. And then we have 2 sons. I have a 27-year-old and a 22-year-old. I've been open with them about my disability their whole lives. And I think they both admire the work that I do and understand the connection between my own experience of my disability and kind of what I've dedicated my life to. And I think to the extent that both of them sometimes experience depression or other kind of natural mental health experiences for young adults, especially kind of living through this pandemic, hopefully I gave them some context, some ways of thinking about it where it's not. I mean, one of the most powerful concepts to me, especially when I was starting out doing this work, was the idea that disability is a natural part of the human experience, and that having depression, bipolar disorder, hypomania, whatever you may have, is natural. And when bad things happen to people because of their diagnosis, that's not natural. That's kind of human failing, that we can't accept that form of human diversity, or we're going to punish people or stigmatize people. So again, I'm hopeful that my sons have grown up in a world where disability is natural, and to the extent that they end up having a long-term mental health condition, they're better prepared for it than I was. And I do feel like your generation, I don't know how old Alex, you and Nyawuow are, but I'm guessing you guys are close to my oldest son's age. He's 27. You guys may be between my son's ages, but I think your generation is a lot more open about mental illness. I think you guys see kind of mental illness almost through a political lens. Like if you're on a campus and you're not getting the mental health services that you deserve or your friends deserve, you see it politically. You understand that the university is making decisions that are not based on the well-being of the students, and you're able to come together and organize and take action to try to fix it. And I just think that frame is a much healthier frame. When I was in college, kids would get, because typically the serious mental health conditions get diagnosed during the college years, sometimes during high school, sometimes during grad school. For me, it was grad school. But young people would just have to take a semester off, and they would just kind of disappear, and nobody would talk about it. and then they would come back. And I don't know, the idea that people would organize around their experience as people with mental health disabilities, that wasn't happening a lot when I was in school, and it feels like it's happening more now.
Kind of tying into that, how do you think that having bipolar disorder impacts your social relationships with other people, or how has it in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of my strategy for coping with depression is trying to find people who believe in me even when I'm depressed and can help me believe in myself even when I'm depressed. So I do a lot on social media. My wife thinks that Facebook is a mood stabilizer for me because I get a lot of love on Facebook from professional colleagues and personal colleagues and friends. And to the extent that I'm experiencing negative energy on social media, Facebook or Twitter or any platform, I'm very quick to block the person so I can protect myself from the negativity. I guess my social network, not just on social media, but in general, has been a very important part of helping me not be isolated. Like, for the 26 years that I lived in Baltimore, my wife and I went to a church in Baltimore called Brown Memorial Park Avenue Presbyterian Church. My wife was an elder there for 6 years, and then I was an elder there for 6 years. Both of our children were youth elders there. And that network was a really important kind of forced socialization for me. When I'm depressed, I don't really want to go to church or anything else social, especially when I'm not working. I try to focus my energy on work when I'm depressed. But I think forcing myself to go to church every Sunday was actually good. It was an antidepressant for me. It was an important mood stabilizer for me. So I think having rituals like that can be really important also, just to kind of give you something else to think about. I'm sorry, I'm not even remembering how this question started. You're asking about social relationships. The other thing that I've done over the years, I don't know how healthy it is, but I've spent a lot of time in my off time playing World of Warcraft, which is a fantasy game where my main character was a rogue where I ran around trying to defeat monsters. And a lot of times as you get to the higher levels of the game, you do that in a raid with other people. So I became part of a guild, and we would raid regularly, and you get to know your guild colleagues, and they're all over the country, and a lot of them are dealing with their own disabilities. So that was also, I think, a good kind of network for me to plug into that was not church and not work and not disability per se. Although it was interesting to me how many people who played World of Warcraft had some connection to disability.
That's so interesting that you say that. My partner raids every Wednesday and Thursday on World of Warcraft, and he talks about how you meet so many different people on there that you wouldn't meet in real life, and you kind of hear their stories and everything like that. So I could see how that could be very therapeutic.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, so I know you just talked about your environment, your social environment. Has anything changed since you've been diagnosed? Like the people around you?
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard. It's funny, Nyawuow, you'll see what it's like when you're 55. It's hard to remember back to what was going on when you were I guess that when I got diagnosed, I was in my mid-20s. But sure, I mean, lots of things have changed. I feel like, your life goes through seasons, and I firmly believe that your 30s is the hardest decade for a lot of people, because in my experience, people in their 30s are the ones that do all the work in whatever organization they're part of. The 30-year-olds tend to be the worker bees. And you also end up having children a lot of times during those years, sometimes young children, sometimes, older or adolescent children, depending on how early you get started. So I was happy to survive my 30s. The 40s were better. The 50s have been better yet. My wife and I are very much enjoying being empty nesters. The idea that we would move from Baltimore after 26 years and leave all of our friends and our church and everything behind was a little risky for us. And we were willing to do it because our children were both in California and we didn't want to be 3,000 miles away from them. And I had grown up in California. And I'm really happy that we moved. I mean, I definitely miss my friends in Baltimore and DC, but California has been, I think, a healthier place for both of us. The weather, gets us outside more. And, it's been kind of a tumultuous first year with the pandemic and the wildfires. I mean, it's definitely been a hard year for my state and really for the whole country and the whole world. But I still I feel like I came home, and there's something about the energy in California that feels healthier for me. I actually really like the energy in Baltimore, but DC was a pretty intense energy, and there were times where it just didn't feel healthy for me. DC is kind of a magnet for people that are very type A. It's the most impatient place I've ever been. So I tend to do better when I'm not around that kind of intensity. I can generate my own intensity, but I need my environment to be calming and not, amping up the intensity.
Perfect. Would you say, is there any stigma that are associated with bipolar, or do you do or anything in that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm hoping that that's changing generationally. Like, I'm hoping you both know people with bipolar disorder and you're not as freaked out about it as, people my age might have been, when we were your age. But I think the way that we're going to change stigma connected to mental illness broadly and to specific mental health conditions like bipolar disorder, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, you name it, is we need more people to be out and open at work with their disabilities. My friend Christine Griffin, who was a commissioner at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and uses a wheelchair, she used to, when she gave keynote speeches, she used to say, the best way to change attitudes towards people with any type of disability is to have a positive experience working alongside somebody with that disability. So if you work alongside a deaf colleague, a blind colleague, a colleague with bipolar disorder or with mobility disability, or any chronic health condition, and you see that they're contributing and they're kind of playing an important role in the organization, I think that's how you start to realize that whatever stereotypes you have or ignorance you have connected to that condition is just wrong. And I wish it didn't have to be just about work, because there are so many people with mental health disabilities and other disabilities who are not working. But I do firmly believe that if all the people who are working, were out with our disabilities, that would result in much faster changes to address stigma. And, in any employer, like my organization, Disability Rights California, we have 290 employees. I would guess that at least 50 of them have lived experience with a pretty serious mental health disability, and probably half of them are out and open about it at work because we're a disability rights organization. But even in a disability rights organization, I have lots of people who work for me with a CEO who's out and open. I have lots of people who work with me who'll tell me about their mental health condition, but they're not comfortable talking about it at work. So again, I just feel like we have work to do to create environments where people feel totally open and comfortable being open at work.
So you kind of talked about being around people with disabilities to kind of get that experience. How else do you think that we could start breaking down the stigma with disabilities, especially in the workplace?
Well, I think the other thing to think about is kind of how to do it in a cultural context. So if you're in a Native American context, what are some of the kind of cultural things that you can tap into that might help to normalize or naturalize somebody's experience with mental illness? If you're, in an African American context or a Latinx context or Asian Pacific Islander or any of the, discrete cultures within those groups, like, what is our narrative? What is our cultural narrative around mental illness? What is our cultural narrative around disability? And is there a way that we can kind of leverage that cultural narrative to change attitudes? I remember one time I gave a speech at an independent living conference with a man who was native Mayan and had done a lot of work with native communities, both in the United States and in Mexico. And, I was telling him about my bipolar disorder and kind of when I got depressed and when I had my high energy. And he said, "You know what you are? You're a bear." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "When you're depressed, you're hibernating. And when you have your high energy, you're kind of running around hunting for fish or whatever." And he lived close to a native tribe in Mount Shasta in California. And the healers in the tribes were called bears. And they were very high status people in the tribe. And they would hibernate in the wintertime as a spiritual practice. So he had a cultural context for what I was experiencing that viewed it as a gift that had to be kind of managed. And he didn't see it as a negative at all. And I feel like there are cultures that can embrace mental health conditions and variations, but we don't always hear those narratives. So, and my experience as a white man with bipolar disorder is not going to be the same as a white woman with bipolar disorder or an African American woman with bipolar disorder or any number of other folks that experience other identities. So I just think it's important for people to have role models that share all their identities, and to kind of think about, okay, how do you interact with police? If you're a Black young man with bipolar disorder experiencing hypomania, are you going to be more likely to take on the police officer? And is that going to be a high risk behavior that could result in you getting killed through no fault of your own? So I don't know. I just feel like it's complicated. It's a common bipolar disorder is very common, but it's not always talked about in a way where people recognize how common it is, and also where people recognize how many people in history had bipolar disorder who accomplished extraordinary things. We sometimes hear about Dolly Parton being bipolar, or Ted Turner, or Kanye West, or whatever the kind of the headline of the day is. But there's a lot of historical figures like Abraham Lincoln that I think had bipolar disorder, although historians have been reluctant to give them a diagnosis. The reason I'm pretty convinced Lincoln had bipolar disorder is he talked about his melancholy or his depression, which he was somewhat open about, but he ran for office 7 times and lost before he actually won an election. And I don't think he would have kept running if he was just depressed. There was something in him that made him believe that he could, win an election. And I want to believe there was some hypomania in there that was helping him believe in himself.
Well, thank you for those. Well, what would you say, what would be a good advice to give people like me that want to be in the field?
I think, are you also getting a master's in around substance abuse and rehabilitation? So obviously it's important, and you all know this as people that are in this program, it's important to recognize that a lot of people self-medicate for mental health symptoms with alcohol and drugs. So if you want to kind of help somebody on a path towards recovery, it's important to kind of help them understand what are the root causes of their need to self-medicate, and then what are some healthier ways to get themselves on a better path that acknowledges their real symptoms and their real pain, and trying to help them get on a path where they're more likely to accomplish their goals. I do a lot of informal peer counseling to folks with bipolar disorder. And I think one of the interesting challenges sometimes if you have bipolar disorder is you don't like other people telling you what to do. We can be kind of defiant in that regard. That's part of the reason why we tend not to take our medications consistently, because there's a part of us that doesn't want to be told that we have to somehow mask our symptoms, or mask kind of, sometimes it feels good to have the high energy and people don't want to give it up. But what I try to do when I'm coaching young people is just ask them in their own words to describe for me what their goals are. And then I just try to get them to reflect back to me, are there things that they can do to manage their symptoms that would make it more likely that they will achieve their goals? So if they want to get married and have children, are there things they can do in terms of managing their symptoms that will make it easier for them to get married and have children? If they want to, have a career, are the things they can do make it more likely they'll have success in a career? And I find if you start with their goals on their terms and not your goals on your terms, then you're more likely to give them insights that might make them more motivated to do whatever they have to do to manage their symptoms.
Yeah, it sounds very person-centered and using some motivational interviewing too in there. I like that. Is there anything that you would like society to know about your disability? Like if you could say one thing for people to kind of get it through their heads about bipolar disorder, what would it be?
It's funny, the thing that's popping into my head is there's an Irish entrepreneur who has a visual disability named Caroline Casey, and she started a organization called the Valuable 500, where she's trying to get 500 CEOs of major corporations around the world to commit to have a conversation about disability inclusion at their board level, and just generally trying to elevate the conversation about disability. But I heard her speak in December at an international event that some of your colleagues have participated in over the years called the Harkin Summit. It's an international disability employment event that Senator Harkin has been doing since he retired from the Senate. But she said that she wants to rock her beautiful difference. And I just thought that was a great way to think about your disability, whether it's bipolar disorder or quadriplegia or blindness, or you're deaf, whatever your disability is, it's a difference. And you can choose to see it as a beautiful thing, or you can choose to see it as a curse, and I think if we could all try to think of our disabilities as a beautiful difference, I think that'll help lead to greater societal acceptance. And societal acceptance of disabled people starts with us accepting ourselves. If we're not comfortable in our own skin, if we can't talk about our own experience in a way where people understand it and are not afraid of it, then I fear that we're still going to have a lot of stigma.
Is that something that you had said that you coach younger people? Is that something that you talk to them about too?
I do. I think it's really important that we all, especially when you have a non-visible disability, and obviously mental illness typically is not a visible disability. Mm-hmm. We all have to learn how to tell our disability stories in a way that make other people comfortable. If we need an accommodation at work, we're going to have to tell our story to get the accommodation. And you make choices at work and in other settings. Which details do you reveal? When do you reveal them? And how do you reveal them? And that's a skill, and one thing I do a lot with my disability is I make jokes about it. I try to incorporate it in a funny way, because I find that helps humanize it, and it can make other people more comfortable if we can laugh about it. But I think everybody has to find a way to talk about their own experience where they're comfortable. And if they're comfortable, then the people they're talking to are more likely to be comfortable. So I'm seeing kind of a question in the written Q&A, and then I'm also seeing questions in the chat. Am I supposed to respond to those at some point, or how does that work?
Yeah, we can go into that Q&A now if you'd like. Looks like it's from an Aaron Cross. It says, do you feel social media has created more of a negative sense of culture? Yes, it promotes healthy. If you search it out, I see students really struggling with social media, certainly high school students.
Yeah, so Aaron, I think that's a great question, and I certainly don't pretend to believe that social media is inherently good for everyone. Luckily, I went through high school in an era where we didn't have social media, so I've experienced social media as an adult, and really I've only been active on social media since probably 2009, so it hasn't been a significant part of my adult life, just numeral in terms of the number of years. But I have found a way to navigate it where it's life affirming and it's community building and it's an unequivocal positive thing for me. But I completely recognize that that doesn't happen for everyone. And again, it's a skill that we all have to develop, including middle school and high school students and their parents. Like, we all have to figure out, how am I going to use this tool on my own terms in a way that makes me comfortable and that brings out the best in me? And what am I going to do when I encounter unhealthy behaviors on social media, and how am I going to protect myself? And those are conversations that parents are having with children all over the country. But I don't know that parents always know all the different ways that their kids interact with social media, or have the skills themselves to know how their kids can protect themselves, especially if they're on a platform that the parent is not on. You know, my kids did things like Snapchat that I didn't really understand what it was, or TikTok. So I'm on kind of the old people platforms like Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. So Aaron, bottom line is, it's a good question. It's complicated. I certainly don't feel like I have all the answers, but I do feel like we all, as a society, we have to develop skills to manage how we're going to use social media as a tool, or elect not to participate, which is a perfectly reasonable thing. I just think it's harder and harder over time, as so much of the professional world is playing out on social media. Like, I tell my staff, a lot of my staff don't do a lot on social media, and I tell them that the disability movement is happening on social media. So if we're not on social media, we're missing a big part of the movement. And I wish that wasn't the case. I wish there were other ways to participate in the disability movement, but in part because of the ease of access and the community building that happens on social media, that's where a lot of the movement is happening.
This question is from Beth. What are your thoughts about person first versus identity first language when talking about disability?
Yeah, so I don't know if you all have spent time on this in your class, but there was a kind of a pretty long period of time where a lot of disability advocates, especially in the intellectual and developmental disability space, but certainly not limited to that space, would argue that we need people first language. So if we're talking about a person with a disability, we shouldn't call them a disabled person. We should call them a person with a disability. And at the same time that that was happening, there was a global movement for identity first language. Like, the organizations that are run by disabled people globally tend to call themselves disabled people's organizations, or DPOs. And they're not calling themselves people with disability organization, because they don't think there's anything wrong with leading with the identity. For them, it's part of disability pride. Own that word. Don't feel like you need to put the word people or person in front of it in order to kind of temper it in any way. And then you have disability specific groups like, the autism community. They tend to like referring to themselves as autistic, not as people with autism. The blindness community tends to refer to themselves as blind people, not people with blindness. So I would say it's an ongoing debate. I would say the identity first perspective seems to get more and more followers over time. I personally go back and forth. I like to kind of show respect to both perspectives. So I don't always say people with disabilities, and I don't always say disabled people. I do both. But I think it's important for professionals to know that there are both views and to be exposed to both views, because it's very annoying when a professional who doesn't have lived experience with a disability corrects a disabled person for using identity first language. That's pretty off-putting, and that happens sometimes. So again, as professionals, I think it's good to have humility, listen to your constituents, listen to your clients, listen to your patients, whatever your discipline is, and try to use the language that they're comfortable with.
Erin said in the question and answer, I'm nodding my head. Yes, I can agree with you more. Thank you. And then we have a question from an anonymous attendee that says, if social media is a big part of disability advocating movement, how can people with disabilities such as ADHD or autism be able to handle it if the nature of social media today is giving off a strong negative vibe, such as cancel culture? How can they feel safe on social media without falling victim to those kinds of current negative social media behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and it really goes back to what are the tools that you can use to protect yourself on social media. So for me, it's about blocking people. Some folks like to change their privacy settings, so the only people who can see their posts are people who they genuinely know and love and trust. But I will say, you're talking about ADHD and autism. Just think about all of the autistic leaders who have found other autistic leaders on social media and have built kind of a powerful network of, hashtag actually autistic people who are tweeting and posting and are building culture and building neurodiversity, building support for neurodiversity, and taking on some pretty powerful enemies like Autism Speaks. I mean, Autism Speaks has been pilloried on social media by autistic self-advocates, and I don't think if they had that tool, their voices would be as loud and heard as much. So I hear you. I think, social media is dangerous. It's a powerful tool that can be used to do good and used to do bad. And we all have to figure out how to use the tool in a way where we protect ourselves and it's healthy for us. But I think if you talk to, some of the most effective, high-profile autistic leaders in the world, I think a lot of them would tell you that especially Twitter, but also Facebook, have helped them find each other and build community. And sometimes there's not an easy alternative way to do that.
I don't see any more questions.
And are you guys looking at the chat?
Yes.
Yep. Looks like there is one in the chat. Do you know of any trauma-informed care and programs in healthcare?
So again, I mean, I feel like you all could probably answer that question better than I can. My sense, I'm a lawyer with opinions. I'm not a clinician, but my sense is that the whole concept of trauma-informed care, trauma-informed, in my case, management in a nonprofit environment, it's a growing thing. There's a growing recognition that a lot of people have experienced trauma in a lot of different ways. And if we don't understand their trauma and how they respond to it, and we don't kind of approach them in a way that works for them, then we're not going to be effective, whether we're teaching in a classroom setting, or we are a clinician, or we're, in my case, managing them in a professional environment, I think it's helpful for any leader to understand trauma and to be thoughtful about how you're going to interact with people who've experienced trauma, recognizing that trauma is a very big category that affects lots of people in lots of different ways. I think lots of people have experienced trauma during the pandemic. So as we think about going back to workplaces, going back to classrooms, going back to in-person settings, we're all going to be processing the trauma that we've just been through, and it's affected, you know, my 290 staff, it's affected them in very different ways. Some of my staff have lost loved ones during the pandemic, weren't able to have the kind of, you know, funeral that they would have if there wasn't a pandemic. Some of my staff have been really challenged by the schools being closed and trying to kind of help their children get what they need to get during the pandemic. So long way of answering, yes, I think that the profession that you all are entering as master's students, trauma-informed service delivery is going to be a big part of your professions, and it's an important thing for any professional to be exposed to.
Can you, this is in the chat, can you talk more about parents and what parents can do to support their sons or daughter who are diagnosed as bipolar? If you have a friend who is bipolar who's choosing not to take their meds, how can we support our friends during the challenging times?
So those are two different and big questions. So I'll try to answer them as best I can. You know, on the what a parent can do, you know, again, recognize that the onset of symptoms tends to happen between kind of teenage years and early adulthood. I mean, there are young children that get diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but it's typically, you know, teenage to early adulthood. And I think a lot of parents would tell you that parenting young folks in that age spectrum is difficult, even if they don't have bipolar disorder. I mean, they're basically becoming adults, and part of becoming an adult is learning how to make good decisions for yourself, deciding for yourself what risks you're going to take, and you know, experiencing the consequences of those risks. So I think it's dangerous when parents become heavily protective of their teenage child with a bipolar diagnosis or their young adult child with a bipolar diagnosis. I think to the extent that a parent can try to understand that your child is going to have to learn how to manage their symptoms on their own, and they're not always going to have a parent there to help them make decisions. So if you can help them believe in themselves, help them make their own decisions, help them experience negative consequences when they make a bad decision or positive consequences when they make a good decision, again, you're kind of teaching them how to be an adult and how to be an adult that may have this chronic health condition for the rest of their adult lives. The other thing I think is just, especially for teenagers, for a parent, is just to have a good line of communication. Teenagers tend to get in a technology bubble and they tend not to talk a lot to their parents. So if you can keep a line of communication open with your teenager and not judge them for what they say to you, but really try to hear them and, you know, love them and be a support for them, that's really important, especially with depression. The first kind of episodes of serious depression are very dangerous in terms of teenagers wanting to kill themselves. If they have access to a gun, they're much more likely to be successful in killing themselves. So I think for parents, you know, take it seriously, try to keep a line of communication open with your kid, and try not to have things in the house that would make it easier for your kid to kill himself if that's what they want to do. So anyway, I mean, this could be an hour-long conversation, but those are some things that immediately come to mind. In terms of kind of friends not taking their meds, for me, it's about letting them experience the consequences. If you're a friend doesn't take their meds and they're obnoxious to you, you don't have to put up with it because they're your friend. You can say to them in a loving way, you know, I don't like being around you when you're like this. This is how it makes me feel. This is the impact it's having on me and our relationship. So I'm going to stay away from you until things get better because this is an unhealthy dynamic for me and I have to protect myself. That may sound harsh, but things like that to me can help somebody who is experiencing symptoms get some insight into the consequences of that their symptoms are having on their friendships and relationships. So I think sometimes friends feel like, well, I have to be there for my friend with bipolar disorder, and if I'm not there for them, they're going to kill themselves, or you know, there's going to be some horrible outcome. And I just think sometimes being there for somebody, and I'm sure you guys also talk about this in the context of substance abuse, but being there for somebody sometimes is standing up to them and saying, this behavior right now, what you are doing right now is unacceptable, and I am not going to tolerate it.
Thank you for that. It looks like there's one more question that popped up, and then with time, we'll probably have to wrap it up after that. But it says, how often do you think disability is undiagnosed, underdiagnosed, or misdiagnosed? How do you encourage someone to seek help if you think they might be struggling with mental illness or another disability, but they may be in denial about it or afraid to face it, especially if they've found ways to cope but aren't living their best life?
Yeah, I mean, so the question of how often do I think disability is undiagnosed, underdiagnosed, or misdiagnosed, the answer is very often. And if you're from a low-income community or a community of color or a rural community, it's even more likely that your disability is going to be undiagnosed, underdiagnosed, or misdiagnosed, in part because you don't have access to the same kind of healthcare oftentimes as somebody who's from a middle class or an urban environment. You know, if you have a friend that you feel is struggling with depression, struggling with anxiety, struggling with, you know, any kind of underlying health condition, I think, again, it starts with you asking your friend, what are their goals? What do they want to achieve in their life? What do they want to achieve in the next, you know, year or two? And it may be that part of loving yourself and taking care of yourself is recognizing that you need some professional help to help you manage your symptoms so that you're more likely to achieve those goals. But I also think it's important to recognize there are people who have underlying health conditions where there's just not a lot they can do to manage the symptoms. You know, we don't have a pill for every symptom. And so part of it is also just learning how to live with your symptoms and to find ways to navigate the world with those symptoms. It's not always just about, you know, medical diagnosis and treatment. I feel like in the context of mental illness, knocking out the most extreme symptoms of a mental health condition is a chemical thing that, you know, we have tools and sometimes it can be life transforming. But in my experience, learning to kind of love yourself and live with yourself as a person with long-term mental illness and see yourself as, you know, rocking a beautiful difference, to go back to Caroline and Casey, that's a very powerful thing. And you can't get that from a pill. You know, you get that from being exposed to people who are rocking their beautiful differences and who believe in you and love you and bring that out in you. And like, you can make a decision that you're going to spend less time with people who make you feel less than and more time with people who bring out the best in you. And that's not about going to see a physician or getting the right diagnosis and treatment. It's about intentionally building an environment for yourself that brings out the best in you. So I think it's got to be a balance. Certainly physicians can have a huge positive impact on people with long-term mental illness, but they don't heal your soul. You know, the soul healing that has to happen does not start with a physician.
Alex, and I'm going to come on and just say thank you so much, Andy. And I'm going to add some closing comments. So I hope I didn't surprise the two of you. You've done an excellent job. Our students rock in this program, speaking of rocking. But I'm the mom of a daughter who is bipolar. And so everything that you said today resonated so well, Andy. And as that parent perspective of just feeling like I was underwater and couldn't breathe during that time until we had the diagnosis and were able to get the help that we needed. And so many insights that you shared today just hit my soul in hearing that. And then knowing that these students that are in this program and having them learn from your personal story and your journey and what they can do going into the field. And I'm really proud to say our own daughter on her journey ended up graduating from this program at St. Cloud State. And that was one of my proudest moments, was being able to hood her at her master's degree when she graduated. And now she's out in California in a community of recovery and being the one that's providing the road to recovery and the journey to good health. And so I'm really thankful for everything that you shared today and really appreciate it.
Kathy, do you want to add anything? Just in turn, I don't know who asked the question about, I think you asked the question about parents, but like if you were giving advice to your younger self as a parent who had a daughter with a new diagnosis or who's dealing with these symptoms, what is your advice to parents?
Don't give up. That is the biggest advice, because there were so many days, so many days where we didn't have answers and seeking help. The help wasn't always there. And I'm a professor in special education, and I had to navigate the system and the social services and the benefits and all of that, and hitting walls, and just not giving up on your child and letting them fail, like you said, and suffering, dealing with the consequences, but not giving up and not giving up hope. And it's a hard journey as a parent, a very, very hard journey, but coming out of it on the other end, when they, like you said, when our daughter found her soul, when she found her ability to be empowered and take control. But it took a lot of patience and a lot of love. Yeah, so thanks for asking. But yes, I did ask that question about parents. Yeah, so thank you so much, Andy. Alex, or do you have any other questions? You two awesome grad students?
No, we're all done with questions. I was just going to close it. I just want to thank you for being here today, and see all of you guys next week at 8. I can't hear you.
Okay, thanks so much, Andy. Enjoy the warm weather in California as we are finally climbing above zero.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good post Valentine's Day. And thanks. I think I was your first in the series. So thanks for kicking it off with me. And I look forward to tuning in to some of your other guests.
Excellent.
Yep. Thank you. Next week, we'll have Thaddeus Ribka with us talking about addiction and substance use disorder. So it'll be an interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Andy, for getting up so early and being with us. We know this is very early time for everyone, but it's also a good time for our international partners to be able to join us at 8 in the morning. So we appreciate everyone being here today. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy. Take care.
Thank you for watching the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. Thank you for watching the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. Thank you for watching the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series.